This is part 2 of Unit 12. Again, we're continuing with the Great Depression. To this unit, or this part of the unit, I want to talk about the impact of the Great Depression. What happened then when the stock market crashed and people lost their jobs and all those things happened? What happened to people's lives and so forth, okay? And you can see a picture here, and I'm going to use these in a lot in the PowerPoint here, this section, because they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and some of these pictures are pretty good demonstration of things that happen. One of the things here that you can see is high unemployment. Lots and lots of people are going to lose their jobs. At the worst part of the Depression, like in 34, 35, they say 1 out of 4 Americans could not find a job. So 25% of the workforce was unemployed. Now, a lot of times students think that's not so bad. Well, we get really worried today when it gets above 10%. Okay? So 25% is a lot worse than that. But also in addition to that is just because you had a job doesn't mean everything's fine. You could have had your pay cut, so you're getting less money than before, or you could have had your hours cut, or both. So even though you have a job, you may not be working full time, or you may be working for less money than you had before because they cut your pay. So even though you have a job, you're not necessarily safe or unaffected. The other thing that I should mention is that this is an average of the entire country. So that means in some places it's worse than 25%. Okay? And in fact, in some places, they say it was almost 90% of people were unemployed. In other words, the whole town was pretty much shut down. Some places it's going to be 50%. Other places it's not going to be as bad. But when you have a high employment rate of 25%, that is severe. That is big time. And what you see here in this picture, this is an employment office, and these are all guys looking for work. And you'll see this a little bit more clearly in the movie Cinderella Man that we're watching for extra credit, those of you that come to that. You'll see kind of this desire to find work and things like that, because guys would travel everywhere trying to find jobs, and sometimes they would have a job for a day or a week and then it would go away, but they would take anything. And so high employment is a big part of what changed. We're talking about, again, the impact of the crash. When the crash hits, how does that change people's lives? Well, people are losing their jobs because banks are closing, factories are closing, small businesses are closing. Just about everything is downsizing as much as possible because there's just not as much money circulating to go around, and people have to do with less money. And so high employment is a big thing. So when you lose your job, then it's going to change how you live. Okay? This picture is an example of a Hooverville. A Hooverville was a shack built up out of anything available, any kind of material, any kind of junk that you could find to produce some dwelling, because people lost their homes. The only thing they could do is try to build some sort of structure to keep them out of some of the elements, to give them some protection, some warmth, some things like that. And they named them Hoovervilles because after President Hoover, who they blamed for the Depression and who they were really angry at. We'll get into this more, but they were angry at him because they didn't think he was doing enough to help them, didn't think that he cared. And so they kind of gave him that nickname for these group of shacks together called a Hooverville, as kind of a slam on him a little bit. So this impact of the crash is about homelessness, and homelessness is very common. You have people living on the streets, people being hobos or going from place to place, riding the rails, it was called, looking for work. You had some people that would live in their cars. You had some people that would live in these Hoovervilles. Lots and lots of people lost their homes because they couldn't pay the rent, or their houses were taken from them when they couldn't pay their mortgage, or when they needed to foreclose on them for the debts that they owed. So homelessness was a big part of the Great Depression. Okay? And what ended up happening to most people is you would live in a Hooverville like this, or some sort of dwelling that you would make, okay? And then you would find a soup line or a bread line for your meal. And these were just what you think they are. You would stand in line, sometimes hours, to get a bowl of soup or a little bit of bread, or if you're lucky to get both. And that would be your meal for the day. That's how many people survived during the Depression, is getting these in these lines and getting these free meals. Now these could be from churches, these could be from places like the Salvation Army or Red Cross. Even our friend Al Capone, for a time, to try to enhance his public image. Remember, people were starting to get angry about all the violence from Prohibition, had bread lines or soup kitchens to try to get people to like him again, or show that he's a good guy. So these were run by various different agencies, sometimes even local government and things like that, to try to help the people survive during the Great Depression, because in some cases that's all that they got to eat. And here's just a picture of that taking place. And these things sometimes would wrap around the block, that kind of thing. You'll see a little bit about this in Cinderella Man. Another good example could be if you've seen The Pursuit of Happiness, that movie, where they're constantly in those long lines to get into the homeless shelter. It's something similar to that. But that's how most people had to survive during the Depression. It'll be interesting in your seminars to see the other things that you came up with as far as tactics or strategies that people use to survive, because there's lots of different ones that people did, and there's some of them are kind of fascinating or interesting. So it'll be interesting to see how you guys come up with that as well. Continuing on with the impact of the crash then, one of the things that was really common is that families were ripped apart. So you see here on the board I have the breakdown of the family unit. What oftentimes would happen is the oldest kids would go off on their own, and they would ride the rails, or they would wander around and didn't want to be a burden to their family, so they would try to feed themselves or take care of themselves in some fashion. They would often leave home. Another common occurrence would be men who simply couldn't handle the shame anymore, would just take off and abandon their family. Sadly enough, in that society it was the job of the man to produce. He was to bring home the bacon. It was his job to provide the shelter and the food and so forth. And when they couldn't do that, even though they tried and tried and tried, sometimes they just couldn't. Many of them just broke down and they just left the situation. They couldn't take it anymore. Another thing, and you'll see a video clip on this in class, is something that was called farming out your kids. If you had a larger family and you couldn't afford to feed all of them, you might split up your family by putting a kid with this uncle or sending them to grandpa's house, or those kinds of things. You would have to do that in order to help them survive, because many times they couldn't get enough to eat. They couldn't provide well enough for the family. And if you watch many movies about the Great Depression, like The Grapes of Wrath, for example, or you'll see this in Cinderella Man, Seabiscuit is another one, you will see that this is very, very common. So families were really ripped apart by the Great Depression because the economic pressure put on them was just so great. They couldn't provide for everybody all the time, and so they found ways to deal with that by, just splitting up the family and doing as best as they could. When this happens, and when the Great Depression lingers, as it does, there's going to be some frustration that seeps over. There's going to be some anger. People are going to demand help and change, and when they don't get that, they are going to, act out. And so when these things are happening, when you're homeless and when you're hungry, when your family's being ripped apart and you're trying as hard as you can, but you can't find a job to change your situation, there are going to be some examples of violence and some examples of protests that are going to break out because of it. And you'll see this again in Cinderella Man. But one of the best examples, or something that illustrates this, is something that's called the Bonus Army. What the Bonus Army is it's a group of World War I veterans. And the government had promised them a bonus for their service to their country. And basically they were supposed to get this within 10 years. The government would give them, I think it was a $5,000 bonus. Well, these people wrote to the government and said, we can't wait that long. We need that money now. We're starving, we're homeless, so on and so forth. And the government refused to do that because, they had planned to, but it wasn't due for another decade or so. And so what many of these vets do is they get in their automobiles or hop on trains, or they hitchhike or walk, or whatever the case may be. They're going to march on Washington, D.C. and demand their bonus check. They're going to go to Hoover and say, we need this check, we need it now. And that is called the bonus army. And that's what the picture here is illustrating. You can see they often, on the side of their truck, would write where they're from and what they're doing and what they're standing for and things like that. And basically these group of World War I vets come camp, not far from the White House, and just set up kind of a Hooverville or a makeshift camp right there as kind of a reminder, hey, we're suffering, we need your help, do something for us, President Hoover. Now eventually what's going to happen is Hoover's going to get tired of this, and he is going to give the order to get rid of these guys and disband them. And so he sends in the army under a guy named Douglas MacArthur to go in and clean these guys out and get them out of town because he's tired of seeing them and dealing with them. He's told them no, that kind of stuff. Well, MacArthur kind of goes a little overboard and sets fire to the camp and causes a panic, and many people get hurt. There's even an infant kid that is killed as a result. And so this really makes Hoover look like the bad guy. The people that were saying, see, he doesn't care about us, he doesn't understand, he doesn't get it, they just said, see, this just kind of proves that point. And it really does a lot to destroy his credibility with the American people, because they now see him as even a bigger jerk and someone who doesn't really care at all. So kind of know that about the bonus army. It's the biggest protest of the time, probably the most famous, but there are lots of examples of violence that break out. Communism, which was such a big deal before, right after the war. We have that Red Scare where people were really afraid of it. Well, some people were openly talking about communism being the solution to our problem. If all the rich people have all the money, well, we know how to fix that problem. We take it from them. And so there was people talking about that. So that tells you that people are really shifting in their thinking and philosophy. And that's, of course, due to the desperate measures that they were in. They were really struggling, and they were willing to do just about anything. Another part of the crash that changes America is people get on the move. So there's a big migration, primarily west, as has been a theme in our country. Move west. Move west, young man, move west was a newspaper article a long time before this that encouraged people to move west. And people sometimes move west, especially to California, because they thought it was better. Remember, California, we now have movies, there's Hollywood, they see those glamorous pictures. They think for some reason it's going to be better in California than where they're from. And so a lot of people are moving west. But it's not just that. Some of these people are just what we call hobos. Estimates will vary as to how many people were riding the rails or traveling from town to town and doing a job for a meal here and then moving on and doing a job for a meal there. But these are hobos. They move from place to place. And we know they were in the millions. How many, we don't honestly know. These were primarily men, but sometimes they were young boys and sometimes even girls. There are stories of boys and girls falling in love together and even raising a family in this fashion. That's the exception, not the rule. But a lot of people are just moving around at the time looking for work. And like I said, these are generally men. But these are hobos. That's short for ho boy, that they used to have back in the days of Reconstruction. A guy that would, as you might remember, the stick over their shoulder with a little bundle tied on the back. Well, that happened after the Civil War. During Reconstruction, there was a lot of people wandering around looking for that. And at this time, they're doing that again. And again, a lot of times they're just looking for handouts or looking for a job, chopping wood or fixing fence or painting this, and for meals. And then when the job's done, they move on. That's certainly a big issue. And then you have the farmers that are moving due to the Dust Bowl. Now, we'll do a little bit more on this in class. But a severe drought hits the middle section of the country, primarily down in Kansas and Oklahoma and parts of Texas. And this Dust Bowl basically is created by this drought, and the topsoil is literally blown away. So you have these great big huge dust storms. And so many of these farmers have to pick up and move too, because their farms are destroyed and there's nothing left to farm. And as you probably know, farmers were really struggling even before, but when the Dust Bowl hits, then it just makes it even worse, because now they can't even grow anything because the soil has been eroded or blown away. And lots of people are moving out. Sometimes these people are called Okies because they're from Oklahoma and they're moving West, or they're Arkies from Arkansas. That's kind of a derogatory name for these people. Point being, during the Great Depression, there are quite a few people on the move. They're moving because they can't make a living where they are and they think it's better someplace else. They're either constantly moving, or a lot of them are migrating to California, where they think life is a little bit better. And it's not much better in California. It's a lot of the same things there. If you've ever seen or read the book Grapes of Wrath, you kind of know what that is. Basically, that's the story of some people from Oklahoma that move out there, and they get to working in these migrant fields, picking fruit and vegetables and things like that, and they're starving because they don't get paid very well. They're treated very unfairly, but yet the company who has excess product is throwing stuff away to try to lower or raise prices because they have a surplus. So people are starving, yet they're throwing food away, and so that's kind of the treatment that a lot of them are receiving. But again, the point being, there's just a lot of people on the move at this time. This picture is a picture of a Dust Bowl, and I'll show you a little bit more about these in class, things like this. But I like this picture because you can see these storms are huge, gigantic storms. Almost looks like a blizzard. This little tiny truck on the road here, you can see in the behind here, is just kind of being engulfed by this cloud. The only thing I can simulate it to is if you've ever seen the movie The Mummy, where that dust storm happens in there. It's kind of similar to that. But the Dust Bowl is something that we'll learn a little bit more about in class, so we're going to move on here to more impacts of the crash. And this is simply the emotional impact of the crash. It's called the Great Depression because economic periods go through recession, and then the worst thing is a depression. But I want you to know what I mean here by inability to recover. It's also an emotional depression. People are depressed. People are saddened by this. It destroys their faith in America and in a democracy. It destroys their fundamental beliefs that if you're a good person and you work hard in America, you can succeed and have the American dream. This crushes a lot of those beliefs because these people are working hard and they are honest, but they can't, fix their problem. And so men have that burden we talked about earlier about providing, and they can't do it. Women have a hard time because their kids are crying themselves to sleep and getting sick because they can't feed them, and she can't do anything. And no matter how hard you try to find work or make things better, sometimes you just can't. And so this inability to recover is a real big problem because it creates really sad, depressed people who are ready to give up. And that's what you'll see in Cinderella Man, why the hero of that movie is so important to many people, because he gives them a reason to carry on. So I guess what I'm saying is during the Great Depression, there's a lot of emotional problems as well, and emotional turmoil. And people had to find a way to deal with that or they were going to lose their mind. And so what I call, and sometimes you'll see it in books, is escapism is really important. This idea of forgetting your troubles, forgetting about the depression for a while and these kind of things is very important to the people, because forgetting about those things and just for a little while is what helps you hold on sometimes and keep fighting and get up the next day and continue to try to find work and to make your life better and these kinds of things. And that was real important. And one of the questions on your seminar deals with that. What kind of things did people do for fun? And you'll find some really interesting and unique things here. Probably what a lot of people did is go to the movies. And on here I have The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. Those both came out in 1939, and they're both really about movies that help you go to a different place and where things are better, and people go through tough times and they come out on top. And those were things that people wanted to hear during the Great Depression. They wanted to forget about their trouble. So going to movies was one way that you could do that. Now, it wasn't like before where you'd go to the movies maybe every week or every other week. Going to the movies now might be, in some cases once a year, or it might be once every couple of months. You would have to save and save and save to do that, in order to do that. And some people wouldn't, but they would be able to, live through someone else went to the movie, they'd come to work and tell you about it or whatever, and you could experience that way. But that's just real important to people, forgetting about their trouble. And movies was a big thing that helped people escape, at least for a little while. So that's a little bit about the impact of the crash, how it changed people's lives, how it impacted people, what people went through and had to experience. Now what we're going to talk about in the next unit then, or excuse me, the next part of the unit is FDR, kind of the guy in the white horse that's going to come in and what he's going to try to do to fix the Great Depression. But that is the end of part